Hello, second grade. Miss Vanderveer here today. I'm going to be recording the last 3 chapters of the Boxcar Children for you today. I hope you enjoy it. A new grandfather. In less than an hour, the town was buzzing with the news. The chauffeur told the maids, and the maids told the groceryman, and the groceryman went from house to house, telling that old James Cordis had found his 4 grandchildren at last. In fact, the biggest part of the town knew it before the children themselves. Jess and Benny came across the lawn to select some white moonflowers for Violet's tray. They were just in time to hear Henry say, "Grandfather." "Grandfather?" echoed Jess, whirling around to gaze at them. "Yes, Jess," said Henry eagerly. "He's the man we've been running away from all this time." "I thought you were old," observed Benny, "and awfully cross." Jess said so. "I didn't know, Benny," said Jess, turning pink. "To think of running away from this kind friend." But her grandfather did not seem to mind. He stroked her short, silky hair and proposed that they all go up into Violet's room with the moonflowers. There was no stopping Benny. He rushed into Violet's room, dragging his grandfather by one hand and shouting, "It's Grandfather, Violet, and he's nice, after all. I shouldn't wonder." When Violet at last understood just what Benny was trying to tell, she was perfectly happy to rest against her ruffled pillows with one hand curled about her grandfather's arm and listen to the rest. "Where have you been living?" demanded Mr. Cordis at last. The whole company looked at each other, even Dr. McAllister and his mother. Then they all laughed as if they would never stop. "Just ought to see," observed Dr. McAllister, wiping his eyes. "What?" said the children all at once. "You never saw it in the daytime." "You don't mean it," returned the doctor, teasing them. "I have seen it quite a number of times in the daytime." "Seen what, in heaven's name?" asked Mr. Cordis at last. Then they told him, interrupting each other to tell about the beds of pine needles, the wonderful dishes, the freight car roof over all, the fireplace, and the swimming pool. "That's where Violet got her bronchitis," observed the doctor, "sitting by that pool. She shouldn't have done it. I thought so from the first." "You thought so?" repeated Henry, puzzled. "How did you know she sat by it? I'm sure I didn't myself." "I was your most frequent visitor," declared the doctor, enjoying himself hugely. "I hope you are our only one," said Jess, with her mouth open. "Well, I think I was," said the doctor. "The first night after Henry mowed my lawn, I followed him as far as the hill to see where he lived." "Why did you do that?" interrupted Dr. Cordis. "I liked his looks," replied the doctor, "and I noticed that he didn't tell much about himself, so I was curious." "But you surely didn't see the freight car then," said Jess. "No, but I came back that night and hunted around," replied Dr. McAllister. "At about 11 o'clock?" Henry cried. The doctor assented. "A rabbit!" said Henry and Jess together. "I made as little noise as possible when I saw the freight car. Then I saw the door move, so I thought someone was inside. And when I heard the dog bark, I was sure of it and went home." "But you came back?" questioned Jess. "Yes. Every time I knew all of you were safe in my garden, I made you a little visit, just to be sure you were having enough to eat, and enough dishes." The doctor laughed. "When I found you had a strainer and a vase of flowers and a salt shaker and a cut glass punch bowl, I stopped worrying." "Didn't you suspect they were my children?" demanded Mr. Cordis. "Didn't you see my advertisement? Why didn't you notify me at once?" "They were having such a good time," confessed the doctor. "And I was too. I just wanted to see how long they could manage their own affairs. It was all tremendously interesting. Why, that boy and girl of yours are born business managers, Mr. Cordis." Mr. Cordis took note of this. "But I don't see yet how you knew Violet sat by the pool," said Jess curiously. "You couldn't know that, of course," replied the doctor. "I went up twice when I knew Henry had taken the dog down to my barn to catch rats. I hid behind the big white rock with the flat top." "Huh. No, that's Lookout Rock," explained Jess. We used to let Benny watch for Henry. We didn't hear you. No, said Dr. McAllister. I didn't even snap a twig those times. But I had the very best time when I went with Mother. Have you seen it too? Cried the children. I have indeed, returned Mrs. McAllister. I have even had a drink from your well. Everyone has seen it but me, said Mr. Cordes patiently. We'll show it to you, screamed Benny, and I'll show you my wheels made on a cart and my bed of hay and my pink cup. Good for you, Benny, said Mr. Cordes, pleased. When Violet gets well, we'll all go up there, and if you'll show me your house, I'll show you mine. Have you got a house? Asked Benny in surprise. Yes, you can live there with me if you like it, replied Mr. Cordes. I have been looking for you for nearly 2 months. Under Mrs. McAllister's wonderful care, Violet soon became strong again, but she had been skipping around the garden for several days before the doctor would allow the visit to the freight car house. When at last the whole party started out in the great limousine, many people looked out of their windows to watch after Mr. Cordes and his grandchildren. Many of them knew Henry as the boy who had won the race, and were glad that he had found such a friend. But when the children reached their beloved home, they were like wild things. Watch capered around furiously, taking little swims in the pool, and sniffing at all the dear old familiar things. Mr. Cordes seated himself on a rock and watched them all, exchanging a glance now and then with Mrs. McAllister and her son. See our building? Shouted Benny. That was what he always called the fireplace. It burns really too. And this is the well, and this is the dishpan, and this is the refrigerator. As every last one climbed into the car itself, and Mr. Cordes saw the beds, the cash account on the wall, the wonderful shelf, and each separate dish, each dish had a story of its own. That's more than my dishes have, replied Mr. Cordes. Mrs. McAllister, who knew what his dishes were, was silent. They ate chicken sandwiches on the very same tablecloth, and Benny drank from his pink cup, and Watch couldn't understand why they went away at all. But it was a trifle cool on the hill now when the sun began to sink, and after rolling the door shut, they left regretfully. Tomorrow, suggested Mr. Cordes as they drove home. Will you all come and see my house? Oh, yes, agreed the children happily, little dreaming what was in store for them on the next day, all the days to come. A united family. Mr. Cordes had been planning this day for more than a week. He had sent his most trusted foreman to his own beautiful home to superintend matters there. The house was being remodeled entirely after Mr. Cordes's own plans, and everywhere were carpenters, painters, and decorators. On the very day that Mr. Cordes received word that it was finished, he suggested the drive. Do you live all alone, Grandfather? Asked Benny. All alone, answered Mr. Cordes. No company at all. At first, Benny did not consider this the exact truth. He considered a cook company, and also a butler and a housekeeper, and when he saw the array of maids, he kept perfectly quiet. The house was enormous, certainly. It was at least a quarter of a mile from its own front gate, and everywhere were gardens. Do you live here? Said Henry, thunderstruck, as they rolled quietly along the beautiful drive. You do too, if you like it, observed his grandfather, watching his face. The inside of the house was more wonderful than even the older children had ever dreamed. The velvet rugs were so thick and soft that no footfall could be heard. Everywhere were flowers. The great stairway with steps of marble rose from the center of the big hallway, but it was upstairs that the children felt most at home. Here, the rooms were not quite so large. They were sunny and homelike. This is Violet's room, cried Benny. It was unmistakable. There were violets on the wallpaper. The bed was snow white with a thick quilt of violet silk. On the little table were English violets, pouring their fragrance into the room. What a beautiful room, sighed Violet, sinking down into one of the soft cushioned chairs. But all the children shouted when they saw Benny's room. The wallpaper was blue, covered with large figures of cats and dogs, the 3 bears, and Peter Rabbit. There was a swinging rocking horse, nearly as large as a real horse, A blackboard, a tool chest, and low tables and chairs, exactly the right size for Benny. There was an electric train with cars nearly as large as the little boy himself. "Can I run the cars all day?" asked Benny. "Oh, no," replied Henry quickly. "You're going to school as soon as it begins." This was the first that his grandfather had heard about school, but he agreed with Henry and chuckled to himself. "The finest schools in the country," he said. This came true, for all the children finally went to the public schools, and are they not the finest schools in the country? In Jess's room, Benny discovered a bed for Watch. It was, in fact, a regular dog's straw hamper, but it was lined with heavy quilted silk and padded with wool. Watch got in at once, sniffed in every corner, turned around 3 times, and lay down. Just then a distant doorbell rang. It had such a low, musical chime that the children listened delightedly, never once giving a thought as to who it might be. But almost at once a soft-footed servant appeared, saying that a man wanted to see Mr. Cordis about the dog. The moment Jess heard that word "dog" she was frightened. She had never thought Watch a common runaway dog, and it always made her uncomfortable to see passers-by gaze curiously at him as he ran by her side. "They won't take Watch away," she whispered to Henry, her breath almost gone. "Indeed they will not," declared Henry. "We'll never, never give him up." However, Henry followed his grandfather and Jess with great anxiety. It was indeed about Watch that the man wanted to talk, and Jess's heart sank again when she saw the dog jump delightedly upon the man and return his caresses with sharp barks. "He's a runaway, sir, from my kennels out in Townsend," the man explained to Mr. Cordis. "I have 200 Airedales out there, and this one was sold the day before he ran away. So you see I have to turn him over to the lady I sold him to." "Oh, no, you don't," returned Mr. Cordis quickly. "I will give you 3 times what the dog is worth." The man glanced around uneasily. "I couldn't do that, sir," he explained. "You see, it isn't a question of money. It's a question of my promised word to the lady." Mr. Cordis failed to see. "She can find another dog among 200 Airedales, I guess," he returned. "And besides, you don't know positively that this is the right dog." "Excuse me," replied the man, very much embarrassed. "He's the dog, all right. He knows me, as you see. His name is Rough Number 3. He has a black spot inside his ear." It was too true. Indeed, at the mere mention of his name, the dog cocked an ear and wagged his tail. But he seated himself as close to Jess as possible, and he licked her hand when she patted him. But it appeared that Henry could understand the man's position, even if Mr. Cordis could not. He now put in a timid word of his own. "If the lady would agree to let the dog go, would you be willing?" "Sure," said the man, shooting a glance at Henry. "I almost know anyone would let us keep Watch, grandfather," said Henry earnestly, "if they knew how much he had done for us." "I'm sure of it, my boy," returned Mr. Cordis kindly. The fact that Henry had been the first to make headway with the dog fancier had not escaped him. But it was clear that Jess would not be able to sleep until the matter had been settled. So the moment the man had gone, the children set out from their beautiful new home to the address of the lady who had bought Watch. The big car purred along from Greenfield to Townsend in no time, and the whole family, including Watch himself, trooped up the veranda steps to interview the lady who held it in her power to break their hearts or to make them very happy. She was not terrible to look at. In fact, she was quite young, quite lively, and very, very pretty. She asked them all to sit down, which they did gravely, for even Benny was worried about losing Watchy, his favorite pillow. He could not wait for his grandfather to begin. He struggled down from his chair and dashed over to the young ladies, saying in one breath, "You'll let us keep Watchy, please, won't you? Because he want him so bad, and Jess didn't know he was your dog." By degrees the lady understood just what dog it was. "We have had him so long," explained Henry eagerly. "It would be almost like letting Benny go away. Watch never leaves us even for a minute, ever since Jess took the briar out of his foot." "So you are the children who lived in the freight car?" observed the lively young lady. I've heard all about that. How did you like it? All right, replied Henry with an effort, but we never could have done it without Watch. He stayed and looked after the girls while I was away, and he just thinks everything of Jess. Well, said the young lady, laughing, I can see you're worrying terribly about the dog. Now listen, I wouldn't take that dog away from you any more than I'd take Benny. In fact, not so much. I think maybe I'd like to keep Benny instead. Benny was apparently quite willing that she should. He climbed into her lap before anyone could stop him, and gave her one of his best bear hugs. And from that moment they were firm friends. But the four children spoke of her always as the lady who owns Watch, although Mr. Cordis paid for the dog in less time than you can imagine. It made no difference to the children that Watch was a very valuable dog. They had loved him when he had not been worth a cent, and now they loved him more, simply because they had so nearly lost him. It was a happy and reunited family which gathered around the Cordis dining table that evening. The maids smiled in the kitchen to hear the children laugh, and the children laughed because Watch actually sat up at the table in the seat of honor beside Jess, and was waited upon by a butler. Safe. Would you ever dream that four children could be homesick in such a beautiful house as Mr. Cordis's? Jess was the first one to long for the old freight car. "Oh, grandfather," she said one morning, "I wish I could cook something once more in the old kettle." "Go out in the kitchen," said her grandfather, "and mess around all you like. The maids will help you." Jess brightened up at once and flew out into the kitchen, where 3 or 4 maids brought her everything she wanted to cook with. And Benny was the last one to wish for his old home. "Grandfather," he said one day, "I wish I could drink this milk out of my own pink cup." This set Mr. Cordis to thinking. He had plenty of pink cups, it is true, but none of them were as dear to Benny as his own. "I think I shall have to surprise you, children," said Mr. Cordis at last. "But before the surprise comes, perhaps you would like to see Benny's pony." Then he led the way to the stables. He owned several beautiful horses already, and nearly a dozen wonderful cars. But nothing was half so interesting as the pony. He was very small and very fat and black. His wavy tail was so long that it nearly touched the ground, and his name was Cracker, because his birthday fell on the 4th of July, and firecrackers were popping. Benny took a short ride around the stable, being held on by a groom. But the second time around he said, "Cracker doesn't need you to hold on to him, I shouldn't wonder," and trotted around with great delight without help. All the others sat down on the fragrant hay to watch him ride. "What am I going to do when I grow up, grandfather?" asked Henry. "You're going to take my place, Henry, as the president of the steel mills," replied Mr. Cordis. "You will do it better than I ever have." And one day this came true, just as most of Mr. Cordis's prophecies did. "What am I going to do?" said Jess curiously. "All you children must go to school and then to college. Then you may do whatever you choose for a living," replied Mr. Cordis. This also came true. "Of course, I have more than enough money to support us all," went on Mr. Cordis. "But if you have something to do, you will be happier." This not only came true, but it is always and forever true, all over the world. "Am I going to college tomorrow?" asked Benny, stopping his little pony in front of the group. "Not tomorrow, Benny," said his grandfather, laughing. "But I'm glad you reminded me. All you children must go over to Dr. McAllister's tomorrow and stay while the surprise comes." "Is the surprise very nice?" asked Benny. "No, not very," replied Mr. Cordis with a twinkle. "Did it cost a great deal?" asked Jess. "It didn't cost me anything," answered her grandfather. "The only thing I shall have to pay will be express." He didn't tell them that the express cost him several $100s. However, the next day the children rode gladly over to see the kind doctor. They stayed until Mr. Cordis telephoned to them that the surprise was ready. And then Mrs. McAllister and her son rode back with them in a big car. Mr. Cordis was as happy as a boy. He led the merry little procession out through his many gardens, past the rose garden, and through the banks of purple asters. They came to an Italian garden with a fountain in the middle and a shady little wood around the edge. Among the trees was the surprise. It was the old freight car. The children rushed over to it with cries of delight, pushed back the dear old door, and scrambled in. Everything was in place. Here was Benny's pink cup, and here was his bed. Here was the old knife which had cut butter and bread, vegetables and firewood and string. And here were the letters for Benny's primer. Here was the big kettle and the tablecloth, and hanging on a nearby tree was the old dinner bell. Benny rang the bell over and over again, and Watch rolled on the floor and barked himself hoarse. The children were never homesick after that. To be sure, a dull and ugly freight car looked a little strange in a beautiful Italian garden, but it was never dull or ugly to the Cordes children or their dog. They never were so happy as when showing visitors each beauty of their beloved old home. And there were many visitors. Some of them were fascinated by the stories of the wonderful dishes in the shelf, and the children never grew tired of telling them over and over again. One summer day, many years afterward, Watch climbed out of his beautiful padded silk bed and barked until Henry lifted him into the freight car. There he lay down on the hard, splintery floor, blinking his eyes in the sun, and watching the children as they sat studying by the fountain. "He likes his old home best," said Jess Cordes, smiling at him and patting his rough back. And as Benny would say, if he hadn't grown up, "That's true. I shouldn't wonder." And that, my dear friends, is the end of the Boxcar Children. I hope you've enjoyed this book, and we'll go on to do more reading on your own. Much love to you all. Liz V.